Africans had the navigational capacity and were actually setting out from the Cape Verde. The documented evidence, both of Columbus himself and of the Portuguese, the oral tradition of the Native Americans, all of these things are there. Until we pull them together, they make no sense, because they're constantly being thrust aside, because they suggest Africans are where they should not be. Let me deal not with that early period, because I merely pointed this out as an example of the method that is used to reconstruct history, and that it is a valid and legitimate method, and the only method that is available to us now because of the great destruction of documents. It was in 1858 that peasants in the village of Tres Zapotes in the Gulf of Mexico discovered an enormous stone head. This stone head weighed 10 tons, just a head, 10 tons. It was made of basalt stone, and it had vividly Africoid features, as Dr. Matthew Sterling was later to comment on it nearly a century later, that it was vividly African, vividly Negroid was his term. It had broad nose, very full lips. It was clearly one of the classical African types. It had a helmet, which had never been seen on any sculpture found that so far in Americas. Close by it was found a stele, which indicated a date of about 291, November the 4th, 291 BC, 291 years before Christ. They were not sure, however, if that date necessarily related to the head. And at that point in time, no archaeology, no serious archaeology had been done in America. However, in 1938, a scientific expedition set out from the Smithsonian Institute, University of California, and the National Geographic, and they found that head again. They not only found that head, but the following year they proceeded to another spot, La Venta, where someone noted they had seen a similar head, and they dug up 4 heads at La Venta. Between 1939 and 1940, 4 heads were dug up at La Venta, and again it was the same thing, enormous heads, 6 to 9 feet high, just a head, weighing between 10 to 40 tons in weight, having African-type features, and the same type of helmet, as Jairasboy has pointed out. You could find it at Tanis in the Egyptian Delta, with a flap falling along the side of the head, a kind of crest with a flap and incised markings, etc. And the extraordinary thing is that I discovered last year through a friend of mine, he's Wayne Chandler, he's an photojournalist. He discovered in the files of the Smithsonian a photograph that has been suppressed for nearly 50 years, which is shown here for the first time in public in my slides, which shows that the first head that was discovered not only had African features, but Ethiopian braids. It's carved out in the stone. It has never been published, it has never been shown. On top of the heads, the stone heads, they found terracottas, that is clay sculptures of Africa. Now with respect to those with the helmets, with the exception of the one I mentioned, you could say, okay, fine, perhaps it's a mistake, perhaps it's an accident. That's what they said. First they said they were baby faces, that's why they had full nose and full mouth. They were faces of babies. Then they said the reason why they have these enormous lips is because they're the snarling mouths of jaguars. These people among whom they were found, Olmec, they worshipped jaguars, and therefore the snarling mouth of the jaguar was copied. Then they said, one of them said it was made of molten rock, and it fell on its face, and that's why it became flat and full. The latest explanation is most ingenious. The Science Digest did an article on me in September 1981, in which they presented my case very fairly and objectively, showing the nature of the objections of the establishment, including one eminent historian of Mexico, Michael Coe. And they went to Michael Coe, Boyce Rensberger, the leading science writer for the Times, who did the story on me. He went to Michael Coe and he said, "Do you believe what Van Sertima is saying, that these are African?" And Michael Coe said, "They don't look at all African, and even if they do," these are his words, even if they do, the reason why they have full noses, the reason why they have broad noses and full lips is because the tools were blunt and they couldn't make them any sharper. That's the leading authority on the Americas, prehistoric Americas. Let me present the case for the dating. On the wooden ceremonial platform where 4 of these stone heads were found at Levanta, which turned out to be the holy capital of the Olmec world, O-L-M-E-C, Olmec, the first major civilization in America. The dating of the wooden platform, the charcoal, there were 9 samples of charcoal dating, gave a reading of 948 to 680 BC. It's not just the stone head, but in addition to the stone heads, you have terracottas that are clay sculptures of African types. Not only the nose now and the lips, the hair is clearly Africoid. Because even though you could say that some Asiatic types who came across the Bering Straits may have Africoid type features, the hair now is very distinctive, the kink and coil of the Africoid hair, very distinctive on the head of the terracottas. And what is more, and note this, the artist went to the trouble of selecting oxide dyes for the clay so that it could be dark brown or dark red or dark black, so that it could be distinguished from the other terracottas. So that on the dark terracottas, you're finding this African peculiarity of feature. And in addition to that, in addition to the stone heads, of which there are 14 spread over Tres de Portes, La Venta, and San Lorenzo in Veracruz, in addition to the terracottas spread all over that Olmec central area, you have skeletal evidence. Professor Wierzyński, a Polish skull expert, was able to show after a study at Tlatilco, at Cerro de las Misas, and at Monte Alban, in the dry areas of the Olmec civilization, where the Olmec from the swamps had moved into these areas. He showed Africoid types. He said it's probably West African. I have just come from a meeting in New Mexico before 200 professors who are studying ancient scripts, who have established beyond the shadow of a doubt, and I shall deal with that later in my talk, that the Egyptian script traveled to America before Christ around 800 BC. They have found on the Davenport Stela the Egyptian hieroglyphs, the Libyan script, and the Iberian tunic side by side, reading the same thing. And it could not be forged because it was found before the Libyan or the Iberian tunic was deciphered. But they did not know the Egyptian had anything to do with blacks. I informed them. Or the Reader's Digest had a big article after my book turned out. Europeans in America, 800 BC, the same period that I had pointed to. Europeans in America before Christ. Who are these Europeans? The Egyptians. It's taken for granted in most of these circles that Egyptians have nothing to do whatsoever with Negroes. In the Olmec world, as I say, you have this corroboration of evidence, the skeletal evidence in the dry areas, because in the swampy areas no skeletal evidence survived. Rasboy has pointed to a very important thing, that is the possibility even of mummification in the Olmec world, but because the skeletons were not preserved, we find it in a statue where you have the rib cage outlined, the hands close together, the fingers open, the shroud, etc., just like in the Egyptian world. Nowhere on earth, on any archaeological site, could you find a corroboration of so much evidence. Stone heads representing a distinct physical type, terracottas representing the same type with the texture of hair and coloration of skin, and skeletal evidence representing that type as high as 13.5% at Tlatilco, going down to 4.5% at Monte Alban. And you yet deny the existence of that type because it involved African, and he couldn't